And the novelist just said, okay, maybe the communications between the stars are just like neural networks. So they're linking to each other and they may respond in another way. So it's much like a neural network, but it's a very large scale one.
Hello and welcome to the STEM and Research podcast. Today we have Qian Chu with us, who's here to share his story with science.
Qian is an undergraduate student at NYU Shanghai, majoring in neuroscience. He's interested in mental functions such as simulation and prediction, their functional roles in perception, memory, decision-making, language, and so on. Hi, Qian. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I should just introduce. I'm now a writing junior at NYU Shanghai. My major is in neuroscience, but people will generally think my research field is in cognitive science, actually, because it's not that neural or to say implementation based. So I got very interested in neuroscience and cognitive science when I was back in high school. Actually, I was in a robotics team there in high school. And so everyone who have made robots should feel the same as me. They're so stupid. Like, I want them to go around the field, touch objects, and they just fail to do that. So on and on again. And I just got interested in intelligence. So I just decided to major in that, how intelligence is implemented in the brain, the wetware, and how we can replicate that. Mm-hmm.
So would you say that is how your interest in neuroscience first began?
Right. It's from control engineering. I know it sounds like very hardware, but also in high school, I also considered going to medical school. So the neuroscience major or cognitive science major seems to me the best combination of the two interests.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how did you get into research specifically?
Oh, so in my freshman year, we had a program for summer research. I went to Tel Aviv University in Israel, and there they host a very good electrophysiology lab, neural electrophysiology. So basically, we were doing neurosurgery for mice, and we implant electrodes into their brain to record the neural activity. And that was my first bit of research. I enjoyed the 2 months there. So it was a long program for 2 months. Usually programs will last shorter. But there I met a lot of PhD students, graduate students, and I really appreciate the environment of the lab. That's quite much something that drive me into research, made me feel like, okay, I'm gonna do research instead of going to medical school or being an engineer after graduation or something like that. So yeah, basically the starting of my research. And when I came back to my home school at Shanghai, then I want to continue my study on electrophysiology. So I joined a lab in, actually it focuses on speech and language, but they use electrophysiology as the method. For example, EEG, MEG, but this time on human and non-invasive at all. It's not ethical. Right. This is basically how I entered the lab I'm working right now. And maybe you would like me to talk more about how I switched my interest from speech and language to something more higher level, like I mentioned in the introduction part, prediction or decision making and so on. So basically, if you think of speech and language, it's actually a very fascinating mental function. So believe it or not, in every second, you should articulate at least 4 to 8 syllables. It's really tremendous. And the movement process is very accurate, precise, and to some extent, very robust. And because of my background in robotics, I really feel that, this may be the way we can solve the problem of control. And so imagine people, so we have cases in real life. We have people who stutter. So why do they stutter when they have very normal motor functions, just like us? They can walk, they can do anything else, but they are not fluently producing speech. Well, one of the problem may be that they cannot generate sensory prediction. So when we speak, we actually anticipate what we're gonna hear. So it kind of, when we're only perceiving what we're expecting, we're accelerating our information processing process. So during speech, we'll be more fluent. So we only need to compare whether it is off the track or on the track. If it is off the track, I can correct my speech. But for people who stutter, it's very likely that they only rely on their auditory feedback, which is very slow. Mm-hmm. So I switching the field. It is called predictive motor control. And so it is quite, off the neural track right now because it's more behavioral and computational models. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's actually really cool. So now that you were talking about it, you changed your focus. So I'm also guessing right now you're more into the computational side of approaching neuroscience. So what do you think is, what's your take on the importance of an interdisciplinary approach in understanding the brain sciences? So like combining all of the fields and bringing together a clearer picture.
So to answer this question, I may want to introduce the very classical field, the very classical theory on neuroscience. Have you ever heard of David Marr and the 3 levels of analyses?
No, I haven't.
I haven't.
Okay, so
so let's hear that.
To put it very short, so David Marr was a neuroscientist at MIT. He proposed that to understand intelligence, we have 3 levels of analyses. The first one is computational theory. What it does, for example, a function, for example, to produce fluent speech. Well, the other level is algorithm. So how the mental function is achieved by certain algorithms in the brain. It can be implemented in computer systems or in the brain. It doesn't matter. It's all that matters is the algorithm. And the third level is implementation. That's where we have wetware, the brain, or hardware, computers. So as I put it here, you may have noticed that the classical views on psychology, which aims at describing human behavior, fits well into the first level, that is the computational theory, what it does. So psychologists say, oh, we have memory, we have decision making, and they're based on several principles. But then cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience came to being, say, we're more interested in algorithms. We aim to develop, for example, the most classical theories in, for example, the anatomy of memory. We have short-term memory, working memory. For example, we have long-term memory. So to subdivide all these concepts that describe the functionality and to make them modular, algorithm-based is basically in the field of cognitive science. And for the implementation, the hardware, wetware, it's electronic engineering and neuroscience. Right. So as you may have noticed, so for cognitive science and neuroscience, interdisciplinary seems to be an essential part of it, because without all the people who come here and describe a certain function from the 3 levels, we won't be able to understand it at a whole picture. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So currently you're involved in a lot of computational research. How were you first introduced to the computational side of neuroscience? And how would you say it's different from, say, like a pure biological investigation in neuroscience?
Mm-hmm. Actually, I wouldn't say that computational neuroscience is opposed to or on the other side of biological neuroscience. It's actually on the other side of experimental neuroscience, because computational neuroscience is more like the quantitative way of describing either molecules, cells, systems, or behavior. So it could be at any level. So as opposed to the experimental side, computational neuroscientists usually first build their models. For example, they think, okay, this model, this neural network may work in a certain way that may carry out a function, but as you see, the theory itself means nothing. You need to test it. You need to either simulate it on the computer and test whether it is effective, or you should turn to experimentalists. For example, I know there's a lab in our school. One focuses on the large-scale brain networks for decision making. So if you know a little bit about neuroscience, so the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is very essential for decision making. And we have another lab that is doing exactly the same thing, but on the computational level. So usually they have very good collaborations. As for me, I'm now doing the predictive model control, which can be implemented by several computational approaches. For example, common filter. If somebody has any knowledge in engineering, you know common filter. Bayesian integration. It is from signal detection theory, and we can test it on humans. We can observe their behavior and measure the variability in behavior and try to fit them with the model to see if human brains are actually, say, Bayesian observers or common filters.
Okay, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I know we touched upon this briefly before, like when we introduced you, but could you probably expand a bit more on your work at Tel Aviv University, and how was the experience of going to Israel? So I know Tel Aviv is really, really good for brain sciences. So one of my mentors actually comes from there. So I'm really curious to know this on a personal level.
NYU is very extensive. It's very large, you know. It has a very big psychology department, bio department, and the philosophy. I think all these departments that were originally there help it constitute a very good neuroscience or cognitive science department. We actually don't have a cognitive science department. It's actually in the neuro department. But as you see, neuroscience is very interdisciplinary, and usually people from all kinds of fields will need to collaborate. The feeling I have at NYU is that whenever you need some tool in neuroscience, for example, mathematical tools or biological tools, you can always turn to someone who is maybe in another department but is willing to help. It's not only for students, but I suppose also for faculties. It's NYU made it very easy to cooperate. That's why I think it's one of the best neuroscience departments in the world. But so come back to my personal experience as a student studying here. I want to say that the neuroscience undergraduate program is very diverse. So neuroscience has many levels. People may be interested in molecular and cellular neuroscience. They may be interested in system neuroscience, which is more focused on all those fMRI data, all the cortical contributions to certain behaviors. Somebody are interested in computational. Well, instead of putting all of these into a very packed and condensed framework coursework, NYU actually offered us a lot of opportunities. So everyone should take cellular, molecular, behavioral, and integrative, but there are only the basic fundamentals. Then you can free choose your topic. For example, next semester, I'm taking perception, neural basis of speech and language. We also have offerings in television, and also a very cool class called Brain and Free Will. It's kind of the collaboration between neuroscience and philosophy. So we also have disorders, many other things, right? So it's more like the neuroscience undergrad program aims to found a very solid background, and they hope students to pursue their own interests and build the other top of it.
So how would you say that your experience at NYU has affected your research trajectory? So for example, if you take the example of your experience at Tel Aviv in Israel, so maybe you could link that to this.
I didn't meant to say something bad to my first research experience, but in Tel Aviv, I was actually a little bit surprised because nobody in the lab knows how to use MATLAB. So
okay.
So it's really a lab that we would define as wet, the wet lab, neurobiology. So they only use, for example, I hate to say it, but it's the truth. They use Excel for data analysis. And this actually made me a little bit surprised at the time. Actually, in the lab in Tel Aviv, my main work was to help them to develop a robust EEG analysis pipeline. And when I came back to Shanghai, came back to NYU, and I found it's not the case here because the total environment here just makes you feel like, oh, if I do not know this stuff, even the fundamentals, I will kind of be trapped. I won't say you will fall behind, but you will feel like you are trapped into a certain subtopic that is not that does not cater to the whole discipline, the whole discipline.
Right. So we just spoke about some of the interdisciplinary aspects of neuroscience. I think it's closely interwoven with cognitive science, psychology, and you need a little bit of math, and I would say also a healthy bit of philosophy can be squeezed in there. So we want to talk about some of the philosophical topics that surround this whole neuroscience field, especially understanding the brain and our consciousness has obvious philosophical implications. So as someone who's involved in the fields, what are your thoughts on these questions like what is consciousness?
Right. So let's just continue with consciousness. So in a philosophical way, consciousness is, well, philosophers would say consciousness is a folk concept. So people define it in their own viewpoints. Well, philosophy will tell you that there is, I think there was 4 types of consciousness. The first one is something about just intelligent self, like sapience. And the other one is wakefulness. Wakefulness is most widely studied in neuroscience. The third one is access consciousness, which is the one that Sigmund Freud was talking about. When he said you have access to some of the mental processes, he is actually referring to access consciousness. And the fourth one, also known as the hardest problem in philosophy, is phenomenal consciousness. Well, having philosophy to guide the way for cognitive science has its very great advantages because, for example, in the example of consciousness, I hate to say that again, but I think neuroscientists are actually abusing the concept of consciousness a little bit now because they usually refer it to wakefulness part of consciousness as the whole picture of consciousness. Well, this is just one example. The example I like the most is from simulation theory in philosophy. So it's a very interesting argument. I'm just going to briefly talk about it. It says that to generate knowledge for epistemology, is a field in epistemology, you can either directly acquire it or you can simulate what the other does. For example, you can very roughly learn how to ride a bike if you see somebody else riding a bike. Well, then it also says something like, so, for example, how will you define a chair? How will you define a chair? Somebody volunteers?
Arnav, do you want to go first?
I would say you can go first, Anvesha.
Okay, so I would define chair as like, I would go more from the physical outline of it. So I would say something with like 4 legs that has a flat top where I can sit on. That's how I would go ahead and define a chair.
Right. So let's take it back to neuroscience. So in neuroscience, we definitely recognize something as a chair. So people have been arguing whether it is a neuron that is responsible for all the characteristics of a chair. So if anyone fits into the category, it is a chair. But people find it very hard to find a category. Okay, something with 4 legs and a flat plane can be called a chair. Somebody would argue, also with a back. Okay, fine. But you can also define something like, oh, I don't have a picture, but you can imagine those weird chairs you can always see in some art museums or creative places or in universities most often. For example, they may have no legs. They may have no plane. They don't have a like horizontal plane you can sit on, but you can still put them inside of the category of chair. And philosophy would argue that this is based on simulation theory. You think this is a chair because you simulate yourself, you imagine yourself sitting on that chair. So you can only categorize something as a chair after you imagine yourself sitting on it. This is simulation theory. Also, simulation theory is very interesting for the sake of prediction. So again, it's a very hard question. My advisor once asked me, what do you think is prediction? So people would say, I know this is coming. The most explicit way of predicting is imagining, right? So it's very interesting. And also, simulation is a top-down process that psychology would talk more about. So you are generating something de novo, that is from nothing, when the stimuli is not actually there. Well, yeah, so in epistemology and in the philosophy of the mind, I'm mostly interested in simulation theory, consciousness a little bit, but from the perspective of a neuroscientist, well, I may not have talk about it, but in the neuroscience department, consciousness is considered as the C word. The C word.
Yeah.
Just like you know what the F word is. So people tend to not talk about it. But in philosophy,
Yeah, I
it's
remember the C word part because I remember you talked about it in the program that we attended, and I think I sent Arnav a screenshot of that, so he knows that too. Yeah. Yeah. Also, another thing. This is slightly off the topic, but this kind of came to my mind when we were talking about the chair. I know, like, there's also like some things about invariant object recognition. So, like, do you think philosophy kind of explains that as well?
I just attended another summer school after I teach for you.
Okay.
It's MIT, the Center for Brains, Mind, and Machines. And the first very serious academic talk and conversation was in object recognition. So, so just recap a little bit from neuroscience. So we know that the visual system has two streams. Which one is responsible for object recognition?
Oh God, I have a test right now. Okay. Yeah.
It's the ventral stream. The ventral.
Okay. It's okay.
I know you know there are two streams. One is for motion and one is for object recognition. The ventral stream from the occipital lobe to the temporal lobe is responsible for object recognition. And people have been arguing over it for, I cannot say centuries, it's too long, but at least decades, how it is actually done. So people, well, generally, we would all agree that any kind of visual or sensory information processing is a hierarchical way. So we have the most basic image, like we call it receptive fields in neuroscience. We can also think of them as pixels, the most fundamental level, and then it rises up. For example, in V2, V1 is the primary visual cortex, V2 is one level higher, and it will extract something like more abstract, like contours, like the orientation of the object. For example, is it straight? Is it horizontal? Something like that. And the most complicated part is in object recognition. So at this part, just like what I mentioned in the example of chair, you seem to be, the fundamental characteristics seems to be missing. We don't know what is happening down there. And people have been, especially people from computer science, has been arguing that, oh, maybe it's just random. So we can train artificial neural networks that can simulate the processes going in IT. You have the dog or cat ANNs, deep learning framework.
Yeah.
But this claim was partly refuted in 2013, where they have a Nature paper where neuroscientists train a linear decoder out of the activation patterns in real IT. I think it's in monkeys. And they compare it to all the later levels of the ANN built by computer scientists. And they try to compare, okay, whether the process happening in IT that is responsible for the highest level of object recognition is just random, just like ANN and deep learning stuff. But they found, hell no, because in those decoders from monkey brains still have, like, I think they have 80% of accuracy, but even the best ANNs can only do the same task. They're given the same pictures. They can only function at 30 or 40%. So it still tells us that, well, I think the wetware is more complicated than we thought. And I am kind of optimistic to it. I think there's some computational principles that are not seen by us right now, but we will review it later.
Okay.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Like human-centered AI is a pretty new field, and I think as someone interested in neuroscience, you might find that really fascinating.
Right.
But I wanted to talk more about the you mentioned some of the epistemological, like philosophy talks. I just want to talk about something that usually physicists talk about. It's about whether the universe is deterministic or not. But we don't nearly address the epistemological perspective that we are humans and everything we perceive is through a human brain and made of neurons. So the universe may be objectively deterministic, but does our brain view the universe probabilistically? Something that you have any thoughts
This is
on
the
that?
ultimate question.
Yeah.
Well, this is a very tough question, and I don't know how to approach it in a cognitive science approach, actually. Well, maybe I can say something like that. So, okay, so for epistemology, so let's forget about the universe, just talk about the environment we're in. Are we truly perceiving objectively all the things surrounding me? For example, this, I don't know, AC controller, the land, the light, the room. Are we really perceiving it as it is? Well, the answer is actually no, because our receptors, all of our bioreceptors, are very biased and very noisy, right? Your retina, your hair cells in the ear, your mechanoreceptors on your fingers for the sense of touch, they're all very noisy. But we're still able to construct, okay, what is out there? And we are able to form a very qualitative way of thinking. In the language of computational cognitive science, it is called inference. Perception is essentially a process of inference. So to answer this question, I'm not very agnostic, I would say. To approach this question, I would say that we humans can still sense a lot of evidence from the universe, and we can make reasonable inferences. Well, it is not always possible for us to even sense the slightest changes, the slightest sensory information from our environment, well, not to mention our universe, but we're still able to infer what is behind right there.
Okay, so another similar question. I guess there's not really an answer to this, but would you say studying the universe is a subset of studying the brain, or would you say it's studying the brain is a subset of studying the universe?
That's an ongoing debate we have. So yes, we would like to know your perspective on this.
And that definitely comes from your background, Anark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will recommend you a science fiction novel. I think it's called The Observer. It was written in Chinese, but it's a very good story. So it was about two astronomists who were in love, but love is not the main story here. But they were meeting every 20 years, and they were observing all the suns in the galaxy. And I think in the end of the novel, the two astronomers, in a very romantic way, reveal that, oh, so all the suns, the suns will, I don't know about astronomy, but they will blink. Okay? So they have periodic activity. And the novelist just said, okay, maybe the communications between the stars are just like neural networks. So they're blinking to each other and they may respond in another way. So it's much like a neural network, but it's a very large scale one. So it's across light years instead of millimeters or nanometers. Well, it's a very romantic story. And yeah, to an extent, I think it can be understood this way. So they're all about astronomy, planet science, and neuroscience. They're all about complex systems. And we also want to solve the problem from two approaches. The most complex ones, the interactions between systems, and from the very micro ones, say each planet, or even at even a smaller scale, like dust, I don't know, elements, and so on.
Right. So I think conclusively that we cannot make any conclusion about that question.
Yes.
Right.
It's a debate that's going to go on for who knows how much longer. And there's never going to be like one party that agrees on anything. But it's still, I think, important to talk about it in the end. So your high school education was in Shanghai, right? So how was the experience? So first off, how was the experience with the Chinese education system?
I'm not saying I'm very positive or very negative about it, but generally I think because it's kind of a common thing in East and South Asia because of the large populations, the competition is over there. You can clearly see it. And in answer to this situation, the education system must be designed to be very fair and to guarantee as fair opportunity to go to college as possible. Well, I was very lucky to be born in Shanghai, which is already a very advanced city. So I was able to explore my interest out of the school curriculum because, for example, I joined robotics club. I also got to do a lot of interesting things down Model UN and the student government and so on. That was really good. But I think most of my critiques will focus on the knowledge that we're taught in high school because well I wasn't very good at math in high school, which is this sounds a little bit ridiculous when I look back now. I now major in math. Well, the reason I think is that we are the Chinese education system. Inside of the system, the meaning of that math was distorted. Like we were asked to solve a lot of complicated questions that could be solved in an easier way, say linear algebra, like calculus or some advanced ODE and so on. But we're only given the same tool set that is actually not capable of solving the problem, which requires a very long and tedious process. Well, I know the purpose of it was to train students to, compete and show your intelligence, but it was not the best way for learning in the sense of acquiring knowledge. And also, I didn't. The very reason why I didn't choose a Chinese college system was that I sensed that it was not flexible enough and not diverse enough. Well, I'm not only speaking to the student population here, because NY Shanghai is definitely very international. We host very many international students, but I'm talking about the diversity towards different opinions and subjects as well. For example, neuroscience was never a thing in China until NY Shanghai. So NY Shanghai was the first one actually to introduce the subject, the discipline into China. And that happened when I was about to choose college. I was thinking, okay, where should I go? Computer science, math, biology, medical school. Well, in China, you can attend medical school from your undergrad. Well, I was into such a struggle, and then I found there was an opportunity for me to meet both my interests in engineering, math, science, computer science, and in biology, medicine, and so on. That's why I chose it. Yeah. So basically, to sum up, my most of my critiques for the education system was its how rigid it is, but I still think it is built dependent on the situation, the very real situation down here.
Yeah, I think that's a similar case in India as well.
Yeah,
like you mentioned,
we relate to that on a different level, so we get that. So I was reading about this thing a few days ago, which said there are two lines of two schools of thought. One, that's the Russian system that believes that you should first learn all of the content and then go into research. And the other is like the American line that believes that you should first find a question and then do the necessary background work and then do the research. So do you think the Chinese system, or more generally like the education system in Asia, does a good job in inculcating those skills necessary for research, like later in your life?
Well, I have to say that when you mention the Russian and American, or generally the Western ideas of education, I think China is right now in between. So it's because we all know history. It was largely supported by the Russians, and many of the college settings, for example, the vocational college, the colleges for industry, universities of blah 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 blah, political science, they were all they're all separated, even though they were one comprehensive university during the Republic of China, which is before the Communist Spring. And now it's definitely, the Chinese government is definitely realizing that this is not a way. We're not cultivating, passionate or open-minded enough people. So they are trying to adopt the American idea right now, but they have to face the resistance from all the 40 or 50 years of tradition. Well, I think that for research that you just mentioned, preparing students for the knowledge first, as the Russians do, will have its advantage because people are equipped with more fundamental knowledge. For example, I think in very traditional Chinese universities for science and technology, we will be equipped with very advanced math and physics for kids. So as far as deep as PDE, partial differential equation, and maybe dynamical systems, statistical physics, and so on. While the American system now also works in China, and because they are also, I think the universities here are also trying to, for example, admit students to only the schools. I mean, the School of Science, the School of Arts, and so on, and let them choose their major, let they choose on which track you want to develop. They're also trying so, but we'll see because all the researchers are at least in most cases above 25, let's say, while the newest generation hasn't appeared yet. So what I can say is judged by the previous performance of Chinese researchers, I don't think the Russian or the discipline or vocation-oriented education was very successful because I think one of the notable evidence is that if you look at journal retractions, so basically that when you faked some data and you have to retract it to avoid it influencing the audience. Well, if you look at retraction rate, China is among the highest, and also Japan, I would say. Well, it's because the research here is very competitive. We have very limited spots for researchers, but very heavy burdens on them. Well, right. So if we recruit people who are more interested in research, who really feel that I am for the generation of knowledge instead of my own career, maybe we'll avoid cases like these.
Right. So I think the ideal thing, it's possible, might be just like somewhere between those two as well. So not just like the American system school of thought that you should start with the research question in mind, and not that you don't have any question in mind till you're like an adult 10 years later, but somewhere in between, like a healthy balance of both of those, maybe something like that might work. So this was actually a pretty great interview. Thank you, Qian, for joining us today, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. We hope to see you in our future episodes.